But speaking of Parliament, in a statement to the Commons, the government says it remains committed to expanding the compensation scheme for victims of the NHS scandal, which saw thousands of people contaminated with infected blood. The inquiry into this scandal recently urged more people, such as family members of the victims, to be eligible for payouts. But the government says now it is too soon to announce any detail. Well, one of those victims is Richard Warwick. Mr. Warwick was given blood products to treat his clotting disorder when he attended Treloar's boarding school in Hampshire. Consequently, he was infected with hepatitis B at the age of 10 and contracted HIV in 1978, but wasn't told until 6 years later. And I'm delighted to say that Richard joins me now. Richard, it must be distressing, to say the least, to hear yet another statement from the government on this issue with no meaningful update on compensation.
Sure, we were expecting so much more from today's statement. We hoped that there would be some information on an upcoming compensation scheme for victims, but we ended up with a 35-minute statement of which 3/4 of which was just filled with platitudes about how wonderful the government had been, patting themselves on the back for the interim payments from last year for victims and spouses of the deceased. It was just everything that we didn't want to hear. Again, they're just kicking the can down the road as the victims are continuing to die.
It does seem scandalous. Can you tell us a little bit more about your personal situation? How did this happen to you?
Well, I'm a haemophiliac, and as a youngster, I contracted hepatitis B, C, and HIV through contaminated blood products used to treat that haemophilia. So this happened from a very young age. I was only 10 or 11 years old at the time. So it's had a huge impact on my life and that of my family.
Absolutely. The government is saying that it's considering intensely the inflected blood inquiry's second interim report. But as you rightly say, no decision, yet again a delay. Do you have any indication about when we'll reach a final conclusion and what compensation might look like?
No, we don't, not as yet. They had the first compensation recommendations on their desks in March of last year. There were 19 recommendations, and they, at that time, towards the end of the summer, they only implemented one, which was paying £100,000 to living victims, and bereaved spouses. And they only did that through duress because Sir Brian essentially forced them to. So we have outstanding 18 recommendations from last year's report, and a further 17 recommendations outstanding from the second interim report. And they haven't addressed anything.
What the government is saying today is that it doesn't want to make any of these big final decisions until the inquiry has concluded. So it doesn't want to make the big call at the stage of the interim reports. It wants to make that decision at the end of the inquiry. Does that make sense to you?
No, it doesn't. Call me cynical, but 500 people have died during the course of this five-year inquiry to date. And we all have the same feeling about it. The government are just playing us. Remember that one person is dying every 4 days. So it makes, as far as we're concerned, it makes perfect sense to the government to hold off on payments as long as possible, because at the end of the day, they'll have less money to pay out. This could run into the tens of billions of pounds if all of these recommendations are implemented.
Well, it's an absolute scandal. Richard Warwick, thank you so much for talking us through this really important issue with us here on GB News Live this afternoon. Really appreciate your time, and all the best with getting that compensation that you and other victims clearly deserve.